Again, because I did it on mute. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Karen at Canadian Women's Foundation. We are about to get started in 5 minutes or so, and so just hang tight and we'll be right back. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We're really happy to host you on this webinar today. My name is Karen Campbell, and I'm a program manager here at Canadian Women's Foundation. And for the last few months, we've been working in partnership with the Ontario Equal Pay Coalition in their efforts to raise awareness and strategize on federal pay equity legislation that we expect to be introduced this fall. And at Canadian Women's Foundation, we see this as an important strategic moment to hopefully make some significant gains on closing the pay gap which has been part of the broader push within the women's movement for a long time for women's economic equality. So we're very excited to welcome Faraday and Jan Borowy, two of Canada's foremost experts on pay equity, to help us understand what this issue is all about and to lead us in thinking about how we can work together to address it. So thank you, folks, very much for joining us. But before we get started, I want to cover a couple of housekeeping items with you to make this session run smoothly. So first of all, on the right-hand panel of your GoToWebinar application, you're going to find a box where you can type in questions. So please feel free to use this if there's anything you'd like to ask the presenters, or if you're having any difficulties with technology. I'll be here sort of moderating that box throughout the session, so I'll try and troubleshoot with you if you have any technical concerns, and I can also throw any questions to the presenters if any come up. The second thing is that you'll notice at the top right-hand panel, there's a button with a microphone, and that should be red at the moment, which indicates that you're on mute. At the end of the session, we're going to unmute everybody so that you'll be able to speak. And also, if you have something to say during that session, you can use the other icon that looks like a raised hand to indicate that there's something that you'd like to say. Thirdly, in that panel, you'll also find a section called handouts. So there's two handouts in there. One is a background document that we had also circulated by email for you to take a look at. And the second is the PDF version of the slides from today's presentation, so you can download it and have it for your records later. And the last thing that you should notice that we are recording this session, and you'll receive a link to the recording when the session is over, which you can also share with anyone else in your networks who you think might be interested. So with that, we are going to turn things over to Faye and to Jan to walk us through the agenda and take us through the presentation. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Karen, and welcome to everyone online. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a large group today, and there are some of you are folks who joined us at the Pay Equity Summit in Ottawa in February, and some of you are new allies who are joining us for the first time, and that's fantastic. We're happy to welcome all of you because we are trying to build this movement, so the more the merrier. What we're going to do, you can see on the agenda, I'm going to start off by giving a bit of context to what the strategic moment is right now and what we're aiming to do. We'll give you some updates on developments on the pay equity, equal pay front. And then we're going to focus the majority of our time today on talking about strategy and developing some action plans for how we can work together, and then taking question and answer opportunities. And then we'll wrap up with looking at next steps. So why don't we start off with a discussion about context. The background document that we circulated yesterday does give you a bit of this context. So if you've read that, some of this may be a repeat, but I think it's important to just ground us in the discussion we're having right now. And the first place is to start with the stats. We've been in the feminist movement talking about the gender pay gap for more than a century, and the latest census data that was released in November shows that we're far from closing the gap. Women with disabilities across Canada, these are figures that are for all of Canada, so you may have seen different figures at different times relating to different provinces. This is for Canada as a whole. Women with disabilities face a 56% gender pay gap. That means that they earn on average over the course of the year 44 cents on the dollar for what men earn. Immigrant women face a 55% pay gap, Indigenous women a 45% pay gap, racialized women a 40% pay gap, and on average, women across Canada face a 32% gender pay gap. We know that pay gap exists in every single sector of the economy, across all occupations, across all income levels, and across all education levels and age cohorts. The gap is real. And we know that when changes are made in the economy, that the burden of it always falls differently on women. So when we think about what the big goal is, we need to keep that in mind. Next slide. There are many different factors that drive the wage gap. These are just some of them to help illustrate it. Women and men do get paid still in this day differently for doing the same work. They get paid differently because jobs are gendered, and that the more female-dominated a job, the lower it is valued and the lower it is paid. Men and women have different access to actually obtaining jobs, and once they get jobs, to receiving training and promotion. We know that care duties fall unequally on women. For women, when they get jobs, there are gendered barriers to keeping those jobs, whether it's sexual harassment and gender-based violence on the jobs or violence that they face outside of work that resonates in precarity in their jobs. We know that women and men have different access to unions, and that many female-dominated parts of our labor market are very difficult to unionize on our current models. We know that women, and racialized women in particular, face higher degrees of precarious work through part-time, seasonal, contract, casual, and temp agency work. And we know that in that precariousness, that women and racialized women and women with disabilities have differential access to hours. That part of the precarity and part of the wage gap is driven by women's unequal access to secure steady hours of work, and they're fluctuating and unpredictable hours. But all of these factors operate on a much bigger political framework that sustains inequality. We've had decades of austerity in cuts to public services, which both affect women in the public service jobs that they do, but also affect women because they rely on women to pick up the unpaid care work that is privatized through austerity programs. The mantra of flexibility drives precarity for women's work. Again, there have been decades of attacks on the ability to unionize. We have persistent undervaluing of caregiving work, whether it's for children, for people with disabilities, or for the elderly. When we talk about the growing income gap, that income inequality is itself a gender gap because the top 1% are overwhelmingly male, and women are concentrated in the lower segments of the income strata. And finally, all of this is operating on an ongoing system of colonialism that profoundly disempowers and impoverishes Indigenous communities. So with that intensely bleak picture, we're very realistic about the moment that we're in and the project that we need to mobilize around. We know that the big movement that we're all engaged in is the movement to build an economy that works for women. And what's important about this particular moment is we have a strategic opportunity to launch a national conversation and mobilization because the federal government has committed in its 2018 budget to introduce a new federal pay equity law and new pay transparency obligations. So as we've set out in the background paper, we know that most women in Canada don't actually work in the federal jurisdiction, and we know that pay equity is only one piece of a much larger puzzle for how to build economic security for women. But this is an important strategic moment because it is a conversation that will be happening across the country that puts the focus on women's economic insecurity. And we can use that moment to build deeper conversations about what women actually need to address their economic security. And so at our meeting in February, we committed as a group to use this moment strategically to build those coalitions and to deepen our roots across the country to build the strength, because without action at the community level and in the public domain demanding economic justice for women, politicians won't move. And we know that whatever happens at the federal level with the government acting on these issues will have ripple effects across the country at the provincial and the municipal level. And so we're hoping to mobilize together so that we can make sure that the government gets this right, and so that we can lay down the foundation for action that will address women's needs across the country. So that is our strategic moment, and thank you for all being a part of it. What we want to do now is to turn to a couple of updates on things that put some wind in our sails and help us move forward on this. So I'm going to turn it over to Jan to talk about the pay transparency legislation that was adopted in Ontario.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much, Karen and Faye. It's really exciting to be a part of this very important national discussion with the Canadian Women's Foundation as we mobilize for women's economic justice. So, as Faye said, my job is to provide a brief update for you on pay transparency. But before I do that, I just want to take a step back for a moment and set part of the context. So for feminists, pay transparency has been a key piece of ensuring access to human rights. We've known for a very long time that employers have a legal obligation to deliver discrimination pay, and of course, discrimination-free pay. Thanks, Faye. And have had obligations since the 1960s, and that cuts across the entire country, frankly. But of course, we know that there are significant gaps in enforcement. And here in Ontario, the Ontario Pay Equity Office, in fact, reported that 54% of employers have gender pay gaps, contrary to the human rights legislation and also the Pay Equity Act. And that's even though pay equity in Canada, in Ontario, has existed since 1987. And of course, federally, there's been a pay equity obligation since 1977. But so by 2004, in the very important Bilson Task Force, which looked at federal pay equity, there was a call driven by women's organizations and trade unions for greater pay transparency. Now, if you've worked in, and that was a recommendation that was viewed as a key element to enforcing pay equity obligations and human rights for women in their workplaces. Now, what for those who are more familiar with the Ontario and the Quebec legislation, there are posting obligations with the Pay Equity Acts, but they're actually quite limited. Ontario's in particular was simply to post in the workplace, post a pay equity plan in the workplace, but it did not require a more public and broader of pay transparency, which would allow others to see what is the pay structure in that particular workplace. So by in and around 2010 and 2011, we're starting to see a movement in the European Union, in Australia, the UK and certain states in United States, which are saying, well, no, we need to shift things. We need new enforcement tools to encourage pay transparency if we are truly to close the gender pay gap. So we're happy to report that as a result of many efforts of women, particularly in Ontario and trade unions, and after much lobbying by the Equal Pay Coalition, Ontario did introduce a new Pay Transparency Act. Now, it was first introduced in the beginning of March, and it was merely a shell. We were concerned it had huge and significant gaps, and we felt that this was a bit of window dressing, frankly. But fortunately, the efforts to mobilize that women took on, they talked to their MPPs, they tweeted, they posted across Facebook. There's a huge conversation about how are we going to close the gender pay gap and use transparency as a new enforcement tool to do that. And those efforts made a big difference. So, as a result, on April 26, 2018, a new amended Pay Transparency Act was brought into the legislature and passed. It's a very, very important and significant moment. This new act will be effective as of January 1st, 2019. And let's be clear, this is the first pay transparency legislation in Canada, so we can't underscore enough the significance of this new legislation. Contrary to the first iteration, this new act applies to both public and private sector employers with 100 or more employees. There are no exemptions. This is very significant. When the government first started to talk about it, they thought, oh, well, we'll just have it apply to the Ontario Public Service and no others. What we're finding, as a result, again, of the efforts to lobby and mobilize for change and to amend the initial iteration of the Act, we've got significant changes so that we now have set in legislation that employers with 250 or more employees are required to report publicly to the Minister of Labour on their pay structures. Now, as of May, and that takes effect, those first reports are to go in as of May 15th, 2020. If you're an employer with 100 or more employees, your first report date is May 15th, 2021. Now, the Act itself makes room for important regulations to be developed, and I can assure you that we will be working very hard on the development of those new regulations, which include that the Act can be expanded to cover small and medium employers, and frankly, and this is where much of the work will have to be done, is on the details of the mandatory pay transparency reports. The nature of those reports is to be set out in regulation, and what we will be driving for is an intersectional analysis which includes gender, plus an analysis of race, disability, etc., many of the important grounds, and in fact, mirroring what has been done in California and the Yukon, so we have some precedent. So there'll be a report, so there will be a fair amount of effort to ensure that those pay transparency reports will be meaningful in understanding the pay structures in a workplace. There are other aspects of the Act which we won't go into in detail, but you can be reassured there's no reprisal protections for individuals. Now, many of you will probably say, why does any of this matter? Here we go, yet another piece of legislation. But, you know, frankly, it is what pay transparency does is give women a particularly important and focused enforcement tool that otherwise hasn't existed. You know, even if you're have a union in your workplace and there is pay transparency because collective agreements are public, you actually don't necessarily know the entire pay structure. You don't know if the non-union components in your workplace are being paid at a certain rate or not. So this helps break through many, many existing barriers where it really does help to show where women and men are paid differently for doing the same work. It will demonstrate where women are underpaid because their work is undervalued. And that is, for instance, you can imagine sections in a workplace or with an employer where you have female-dominated work, and the question is, well, how are women undervalued? These pay transparency of legislation will demonstrate how women are concentrated in precarious employment. We know if you're casual or part-time in many sections of many provinces across Canada, your employer cannot provide equal pay. Now, there's been some changes here in Ontario with additional protections in the Employment Standard Act for women who are in precarious work to be paid, to receive equal pay, but that doesn't exist across the country. So pay transparency is a way to demonstrate and provide the evidence of these huge inequalities that exist for women in precarious work. And further, it will help us better see where women are systemically denied opportunities for training and advancement. So it'll help to demonstrate where that glass ceiling actually exists. So if you may wonder, well, really, how truly effective are these kind of acts? And well, we first got a window into this on April 5th this year. Interestingly, the legislation in the United Kingdom kicked off. Reports were due, and they were made fully public on the internet, as they will be done here in Ontario. So let's look at some of those results. So, interestingly, and I just need to make this point, on the federal jurisdiction, we know banks are regulated federally. So we know that those banks have appeared in front of the federal government's Special Committee on Pay Equity and said, we are pay equity compliant. Well, that's a nice position to take in front of a federal committee. So let's take a look at what's happening over in the UK. I'm not suggesting that they're not pay equity compliant here in Canada, but let's take a look at what's going on in the United Kingdom. So RBC, Royal Bank, Europe. Women's mean wage is 51% lower than men's, and their median is 57% lower. Now, let's take a look at bonus pay. Bonus pay is a key aspect of total compensation. Oh, women are getting 65% lower than men's, and their median is 86% lower than men's. Now, the reports that are done in the UK divide the pay, ask employers to report on their pay structure by quintile. So they quartile, sorry. So they break it into 4 groups. And there you really begin to see where the pay gaps exist across the 4 key components of a pay structure in RBC in Europe. And so you'll see a couple of things that are interesting. Obviously, women are concentrated in the lower quartile, and men are higher paid and in the top quartile, where women are lower paid. So it's very important research, very important report. So another second example, I'll run through this very quickly, Toronto Dominion Bank. We're seeing the same trends, the same systemic discrimination exists within their pay structure, particularly when we look at hourly rates. Women are receiving significantly lower hourly rates than men on a mean and median. Again, this aspect of bonus pay, which is such an important part of compensation in many workplaces. Again, women are receiving significantly lower amounts than men. And interestingly, the 2 banks actually aren't that far apart when you look at their pay structures, where you're looking at top quartiles. And again, you're seeing a significant disparity between women and men. So, as Faye mentioned, in the federal budget in February, the federal government is committed to introducing pay transparency. As I've said, it's a very significant enforcement tool. It ensures that women will have greater accountability and place greater accountability on employers to demonstrate that they are have set a pay structure that's discrimination-free. And this is a very significant and important tool. We can't say that enough. And so we've made important inroads here in Ontario, and we look forward to working with you to make sure we can pursue this in a very effective way federally. So Faye, the Supreme Court.
Yeah, so the other big bit of news since we last gathered in February is that the Supreme Court of Canada released its decisions in two pay equity appeals. Both of the appeals began in Quebec. One of them dealing with childcare workers, so women in predominantly female, even exclusively female workplaces, and what access to pay equity they have. And the other case is one that raised issues about pay equity maintenance that are significant for all women in all occupations, that once you receive you achieve pay equity and you close the initial gaps in your workplace, what sort of protection do you have to ensure that the gaps stay closed going forward? The fact that the cases came out of Quebec is not in any way an impediment to their significance, in the sense that they came out of Quebec, but the rulings from the Supreme Court apply right across the country, and so the principles that have been articulated apply for everyone, and we can use them. There's three key things that have come out of those decisions, three themes. One is a set of principles that help with myth busting. The second is some key standards that are identified to redress systemic discrimination, and the third is that the court debunks some of those arguments that employers and governments have been using for years to try to defeat equality claims. So on the myth-busting front, what the court has done has clearly said systemic sex discrimination in pay is real. And I know that many of you in the work that you do will have employers or people say to you, oh, the gender pay gap isn't real. We've given you the census data, it is real. And the Supreme Court of Canada has also accepted that it's real. They have talked about how systemic sex discrimination creates a deep and persistent gap between men's and women's pay, and how that same systemic sex discrimination deprives women of benefits that are routinely enjoyed by men. What they point out is that men, as a matter of course, have compensation that reflects the value of their work, but women don't. And it's that undervaluation and underpayment of women's work that is one of the drivers of the pay gap. What they've also reinforced, and is something that women's activists have been saying for decades and generations, is that occupational segregation is deeply connected to the devaluing of work, that the more female-dominated work is, the lower it's paid. And the court confirmed that, yes, women in female-dominated work face the deepest sex discrimination. The second set of themes that come out of those decisions is that the court identifies some key protections that are necessary for women to achieve equality. The first that the court identified, we're having a bit of a lag on the slides, so your slide will come up shortly. The first one that the court identified is the importance of access to information to identify systemic discrimination. And that's something that, picks up from what Jan was saying around pay transparency. If you don't have the information about how pay is structured in your workplace, how can you file complaints to have that discrimination rectified? And what the court said is that workers have to have access to information about the pay structure, have to have information on the pay structure in order to determine if there is a gap in a pay gap in their workplace. What they also identified is that women in female-dominated areas of work can't be denied rights to equality, that whether or not there are men in those workplaces, sex discrimination systemically across society affects their pay rates. One of the arguments that we hear is that, oh, it's not discrimination, it's just the market. Well, the market is imbued with those discriminatory attitudes that actually undervalue and underpay women. What the court also identified is that employers must take action to close identified gender pay gaps, leaving wage inequities in place. And this is Jan's favorite line from the decision. Leaving those wage inequities in place makes women the economy's ordained shock absorbers, and that can't continue to happen. And finally, the court said that the right to equality is an ongoing, continuous right, that it's not an intermittent or partial right. Your right to equality exists at all times at the same high standard. And so the remedies for discrimination must also be continuous and ongoing. You can't sort of hive off a particular period of time and say, well, discrimination happened then, but you don't have a remedy for it. So those are all important things that help us as we move forward. And then the third stream of ideas is that the court has rejected some of the common arguments that, or strategies that governments and employers have put forward over the years. Recently, we've seen a number of governments saying that we're faced with this really widespread non-compliance on discrimination-free pay. Employers don't want to comply because it's too hard, and now they've built up these big liabilities, and so they don't want to pay it. And so they've said, well, if we can just make it easier, if we can just streamline those obligations and make it less hard for employers to comply, then maybe they will. And the court said no, that you can't lower the bar in order to try to convince employers to comply with the law. Reducing employers' obligations in the hopes of encouraging compliance, the court says, subordinates women's constitutional right to equality to employers' willingness to comply with the law. And that willingness to comply is not the standard. The right to equality is the standard, and employers must step up to meet it. The other thing that governments have often said is, well, we didn't cause discrimination. We kind of, like, it was broken. We found it that way, right? The market has just done this over generations, so it's not our fault. And the court rejects that not our fault defense to discrimination. And they've said that a law that perpetuates existing discrimination violates the Charter. All of these help us in this moment push for stronger laws. I want to go back just briefly to that idea about access to information, because that's so key. For all these years, we've had various laws that require women to step forward and file complaints about how they're being treated, but we know it's not an individual problem. We know it's a systemic problem, and access to information is the key. And so things like pay transparency and the court recognizing that women must have access to that information flips the onus, and it says to employers, you need to prove you're complying. And that's a really significant power shift in the public discourse. So with that background, let's talk strategy. One of the things that we were hoping to do today is to ask you a number of questions and get your feedback so that we can get the feedback live through our exciting polling technology. So, Karen, do we have question number 1 up?
We do. Okay. Question number 1 is up on your screen, so you should be able to take a look and select an answer.
So for you and women in your community, what are your key demands of government to promote women's economic justice? And you can pick as many of the ones on that list as are relevant for you, and also use the question box to add in other things. We've just selected, obviously we only have 5 spaces on the poll, but we know that that's not all that matters. So use the question box to add in the top things that matter for you and the women in your community.
So I think, Faye, it's important for us to also point out that we did not put a strong, robust pay equity law on this as one of the options. We're assuming, frankly, that I think everyone agrees that it's important to have such a law, but of course it is only one element, as you said earlier, that will help close the gender pay gap. So this is really an option for us to think big and say to the government, because you are moving on pay equity, you should be moving on pay equity. There's still many aspects of public policy that require your attention.
So we can see about 71% of you have voted so far.
And Karen, do we get the results?
We do, yeah. So I'm just going to give a couple more seconds because I think some people are still logging their responses. Okay, we'll take a look.
Okay, let's see.
So,
yep. Oh. Okay, so we see increased minimum wages and living wage is the top demand, followed by a national child care program, strong employment equity laws, fully funded social and community services and agencies, and improved access to collective bargaining. So all of those are things that have strong support. And do we have other things in the question box?
We do. So we have, someone is suggesting proactive applications of the principles of pay equity going beyond the minimums set out. We have improved parental leave, paid parental leave. Mm-hmm. We've got increased access to education around pay rights. And we've got measures that address other forms of systemic discrimination, such as racism, within pay equity laws and within pay transparency legislation and others.
Okay, good.
Great. Jen, do you want to do number 2?
Yes, so question number 2, in terms of strategy. And we'll just put the question up there in a moment. Here we go. So, thank you, Karen. So the question number 2, and again, you can choose multiple options here. What resources do you need to expand the conversation about women's economic justice and closing the gender pay gap? And you see, you can. This will, frankly, your answers here will help the Canadian Women's Foundation and the Equal Pay Coalition, Faye and I, help to organize resources in the next coming months. So here we have backgrounders or fact sheets on specific issues, resources for lunch and learn, seminars and workshops. So that's an opportunity to start to organize group discussions in your communities or your agencies about women's economic justice, web links to other women's organizations and their demands. There are many women's groups who are participating on this call today who have very specific demands, and it's always so important to share those demands and really build the capacity that we have to better understand women's economic justice. Regular CWF webinars to discuss strategy and issues, and then whether or not the Canadian Labour Congress's model pay equity legislation should be made available as a resource. So let's see what the participants have to say about this. The polls are open.
And, oh, excellent.
Oh, wow.
So lots of demand for backgrounders and fact sheets, resources for lunch and learns. So the sort of things that we can do in that respect are help put together talking points, or if we're putting together a lobby kit, we can do, Jan and I can do a webinar on how to lobby, things like that. So as you think about these things and you think with real precision about what it is that will help you, please feel free to use the question box for any additional comments. And also, you can always write to us after the webinar and give us detailed ideas about what would help you. But we thought...
Any
okay,
comments?
There's one comment, that backgrounders, fact sheets, and other resources should be multilingual.
Yes, and we're hoping to do that as well. And so one of the things that will be helpful for us is if you can let us know what languages will be most helpful for the communities that you're working with, so that we're using our resources in the way that'll be most effective for you. But certainly we want to make them as accessible as possible. So poll number 3, we had anticipated that backgrounders and fact sheets would be on your wish list. And so what specifically do you need backgrounders and fact sheets on? We've identified some. Is it about explaining the gender pay gap in an intersectional way? And when we talk about that, we are always addressing the pay gap in an intersectional way, as we did on the first slide, identifying who really bears the burden. Is it about explaining pay equity or equal pay? Is it connecting the gender pay gap with racialized poverty? Is it about how to connect what's happening on federal pay equity with the kind of initiatives that are happening locally for you? Like for many of you, as I said off the top, you may not be working in the federal jurisdiction, but we have a moment to talk about women's economic justice. So do you need help in connecting that with what's happening locally for you? Is it about connecting the gender pay gap with precarious work? What else? Again, use the question box to let us know specifically what topics will help you, what specific backgrounders and fact sheets on what specific topics will help you in working with your communities.
So what responses do we have, Karen?
Here you go.
Oh, right. So it appears that we have a tie, but nonetheless, deeply connected. So we've got both explaining and connecting the gender pay gap in an intersectional way and linking that with racialized poverty. Certainly, obviously, race, as the statistics from the census demonstrate, racialized women, Indigenous women, are the most impoverished in Canada's labour market and are facing the biggest gender pay gap. So we can certainly make those links. Explaining pay equity. What comes next? Oh, and also on Tide, connecting it with precarious work. Absolutely. Because of that intricate connection between part-time, casual, temporary work and low wages. And then we've got connecting local, what have we got?
Federal, the federal initiatives with local initiatives.
With local initiatives,
yeah.
Yes. So, very good. That absolutely can be done. And Karen, are there any comments or questions?
There are a couple of comments. So the first is connecting pay equity and the child care crisis.
Absolutely, we can do that.
Okay.
We absolutely doing a connection there.
A myth-busting focused fact sheet would also be helpful for folks.
We do have some great myth-busting resources available, and we can make those available.
And then another comment is a preference for explaining economic justice, so a broader concept that goes beyond pay equity versus pay equity.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good.
That is great. And as we said, the pay equity isn't the be-all and end-all. It's just the strategic moment of leverage that we have, but it is all in aid of, like, our mobilizing together is all in aid of building an economy that works for everyone. And so we are keeping our eye on that big picture economic security.
Okay, so next.
Okay.
We're on question number 4. This is quite specific question. Again, we'll run through this very quickly. What tools do you and women in your community need to mobilize on women's economic equality and justice and closing the gender pay gap? So we give you some options here. For instance, and these are real tools, specific tools. So do you need to know who the MPPs are to lobby on women's economic justice? Speaking notes, lobby kits, videos, social media shareables.
And anything else, again, added in the question box.
And we'll see what those answers look like.
People are still voting, so we'll just give a couple seconds more.
I must say this real-time response through this polling mechanism is a extraordinarily exciting and useful tool. This is a terrific way to help us focus our resources and emphasis.
All right. There we go.
All right, just to summarize, we can see there that speaking notes on closing the gender pay gap, okay, and lobby kits. Those two would go hand in hand, it seems.
Yep.
Then next, social media shareable. Okay, that's good to know. Followed by a list of key MPs to lobby on women's economic justice and videos. So that's very helpful, which gives us a better sense of what we need to be working on quickly.
Mm-hmm. And an additional comment here is that lobby kits could be tailored to specific racialized identities and languages.
Okay.
Two more quick questions. Question number 5. And this is one where we're going to ask you to tick either the first box or the second box, and then the third box you can tick as well. So the first two are either you know about local initiatives or you're thinking about them, and do you have resources you can share with the group. So this is about what initiatives are happening in your organizations or your local communities that we can amplify together. The point of coming together, mobilizing us together is that we're stronger together and that we can amplify each other's voices. So what local initiatives are you engaged with that can connect up with this, that we can lend our voice to, that we can help connect to this bigger national conversation on women's economic justice? And what resources do you have to share?
Okay,
so some of you have local initiatives that are happening on the ground, and if you give us the information about that in the question box, we will share that information, and we can think about how to connect the conversations. If you're able to send the resource that you have that you're willing to share, if you send them, we've got our addresses at the end of the presentation. We'll make sure to share them with the group at large. But for those of you who are thinking about initiatives, please do follow up with us. And Karen Dick, our organizer, will also follow up with you, because we do want to keep the momentum going, so that we can remain active and visible as this comes forward.
Okay. So our final question, which Karen will put up for us, has to do with whether you would be interested in joining in on a Canadian Women's Foundation national lobby for women's economic justice and closing the gender pay gap. Now, the idea of a national lobby day actually was identified at the summit co-hosted by the Canadian Labour Congress and the CWF in February. And we just wanted to follow up with you about this. So your options are yes, no, I'll think about it. And please, again, in the chat box, please provide your name and contact information if you'd like to be interested in, or alternatively get in touch with Karen Dick, our organizer, who can help collate the information for us. But we see this as a unique, as Faith said, we're at a strategic moment. We have access to a government that is interested in developing proactive pay equity. We know it's a limited response to the deep gender inequality and the gender pay gap, but nonetheless it provides us with a huge opportunity to say to the government, enough is enough. It's the time to close the gender pay gap is now. It's time for women's economic justice. So let's see what the respondents say.
Okay, we're just about to close that poll. And here we go.
Terrific.
Excellent. For those of you who are thinking about it or who are unsure about participating in a lobby day, one of the trainings that I can fully anticipate that we'll do on a future webinar is a lobby training. How we'll develop lobby kits, and we'll do some trainings on how to get out and do those meetings. But this is fantastic. And so, Karen, why don't you let us know what questions have been added in the question box?
Sure. There's a number of folks who've been chiming in. Most are just indicating their interest in lobbying and in being involved and adding their contact information for us. It looks like some folks in New Brunswick have got some PowerPoints and other resources on pay equity that they can share, so we can follow up about that. And also a reminder or a call for resources in French and a specific question about this presentation and whether or not we can make it available in French as well.
Let me just speak briefly to the question on doing French presentations. We were asking people as we were reaching out about this webinar if people would like to have a webinar in French. And we're working on that. We definitely want to make sure that we can make our information available in English and in French. And when we do fact sheets, we will translate them. We'll definitely get back to you in terms of a date and program for French language webinar.
Good.
Okay, so questions. So we have time for some questions. Can we stay past 2?
Yeah.
We're happy to stay here. We had originally planned to wrap at 2, but we can continue on past that. So can we open up the lines now for folks who'd like to raise questions?
Yeah, so the way that you need to do it is if you'd like to make a question or a comment, please just do your hand raising icon, and that will let me know that I need to turn your mic on for you, because I can't let everybody have free-for-all open all at once, it won't work very well. So I can see that Jane has her hand raised. So Jane, I'm just going to turn your microphone on, and if you'd like to chime in, please go ahead.
Oh dear, I hope that wasn't me because I didn't mean to have my hand raised.
you did have your hand raised, but that's
Sorry.
absolutely fine.
Pass.
Okay.
Thanks, Jane.
Anyone else? Oh, Joanne's got her hand up, so I will enable your mic. Please go ahead, Joanne.
Okay, I was just wondering what's been done in terms of lobbying so far for the Pay Equity Act, the future Pay Equity Act at the federal level.
We have, Jan and I have met with people in the Labour Department federally about it who were involved in drafting it, and the Canadian Labour Congress has been meeting with Scott Bryson in Treasury Board, who is holding the lead on this. So Jan and I have been speaking with some of the technical folks in Labour who've been trying to figure out how to draft the legislation, and the CLC's been talking at the policy level with Treasury Board. But we need to broaden that lobbying effort, and it's important that the government be hearing from women across the country, so they know that this is a matter of concern for women. And so we're absolutely, when we're thinking about organizing a lobby day, we'd like it to be as inclusive as possible.
And Joanne, to be clear, Faye and I have not had an opportunity to speak with any of the technical folks since the February summit. The CLC produced the model legislation on pay equity following the summit, but I know the CLC and some of the affiliates have been in discussions with different technical folks, and as Faye said, with Bryson's office. But you know, it's time to broaden out the conversation and let MPs know that this is a very critical and important issue, and it's fundamentally about women's economic justice.
And it is something that's really important for us to be mobilizing and be present and be seen to be present on over the coming 4 months. We had heard rumors initially that the legislation was going to be introduced in May. Obviously, that hasn't happened. We've heard rumors that it will be introduced as part of the budget implementation bill in the fall. And if it is introduced as part of the budget implementation bill, what that means is that there will be limited opportunity to seek amendments on it. So we need to make our voices heard now.
All right. Does anyone else have questions?
If there are no questions, if I could just interject here with a brief shout out. Joanne Perome is on the line from the New Brunswick Coalition for Pay Equity, and Joanne, the Women's Legal Education Fund, as well as Faye and I were involved as interveners in those Supreme Court cases. And, you know, I just want to say that those were quite important. And Joanne, to you and your group, and Leaf and others, thank you for your involvement. It made a significant difference.
Any questions? Any other questions? I don't see any hands raised at the moment, and nothing in the question box at this point.
Okay, so why don't we turn to next steps? What we will do is we will continue to share information within this network. If you are new to the call, please let us know that you want to stay involved. We will assume that you do. If there are other organizations in your communities who you think should be part of this conversation, absolutely let us know, and feel free to connect them with us. We have set webinar dates over the next little while just to keep the momentum going. We've heard your wish list, and we will get down to work preparing those fact sheets and resources for you. We'll touch base. We'll have another webinar at the end of June, on June 26th at 1 o'clock, to pick up the discussion and to keep the momentum going. I know many people are away in the summer, but we've set a date for July 24th, and then another one for September 6th, once everyone's back, to make sure that that we keep active and that we can keep building our strength together. After the legislation is introduced, Jan and I will be circulating an analysis of the draft legislation, and then we will have a very focused webinar on lobbying efforts at that point. But, you know, in the big scheme of things, this is building an economy that works for women is not something that gets done in 6 months. This is just a strategic moment that we are grabbing right now, but this is a long fight, and we plan to be with you there in that fight for the duration. There are some organizations that, as we were looking at the sign-up lists for the call, there were some organizations that had multiple people sign up from a single organization, and if you would like us to come into your organization, either in person or via webinar, to do particular trainings for your organization, absolutely let us know. We'll be happy to do that, because I know that connecting these issues to the needs of your specific communities is something that is unique for each of you, and we're happy to work with you to see how we can strengthen our connections.
Just that we're, as Faye says, we're very much looking forward to working with you in the coming months ahead. And I know that we can build enormous strength across this country. When we look at who was participating on this call, it's a fantastic and an amazing first step. And I know we can build from here, and our voices can be heard loud and clear.
Next page. So there's a lot, we've given you a lot to think about, and please get in touch with us. We've asked you a lot of questions specifically about what we can do to support your work. And so if you didn't get a chance to put it in the question box, if you want some more time to think about it, if there's anything you want to reach out to us about, those are our that's our contact information. So that's for me, Faye, for Jan, and Karen Dick, who is our organizer, who many of you will have spoken to. But otherwise...
There's another question in the box.
Oh, there's another question. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, question.
So Jane is just asking, when do you plan to hold a lobby? Early fall?
Why don't people let us know what they think might work? If you can send in your information to Karen. You know, I think the question will be around the timing around the legislation, and September might be the best date. But let's take a look at it, and we'd love to hear back from you as well when you think the most opportune time will be.
Great. Excellent. Okay. If you have no more questions, then we will wrap for now, and we will see you out on the streets, in the communities, on social media, and wherever else you are fighting the good fight. Thanks so much, everyone.
And we'll talk to you in June. Bye for now.